We filled out the audience a little bit more since the meeting. Are you telling me that this is more interesting than our financials? I don't blame you. This is going to be more fun. We are super excited for our featured speaker tonight. It is unfortunate that we weren't able to do it on a very auspicious day when the last meeting was going to happen, which was Camilla's birthday. I know. That's what we said. Rachel and I were like, we were going to have birthday cake for you guys. I know. Snowmageddon, the one time we were going to have it. And it was also, as we're celebrating things, this year is, for good or for bad, 50 years of the Sudanese Liberation Army as well. It's 50 years since Patty Hearst was kidnapped on February 4th of 74. So this is a timely event for everyone, and we are also excited because Rachel and Eileen both put together a wonderful exhibit on Camilla Hall as well. If you haven't gotten a chance to see that, we do have that in the gallery. Up in the front of the building over there. We hope you take a chance to take a look at it. Learn a little bit about Camilla tonight from our speaker, Rachael Hanel. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, Jessica, and for inviting me. And thank you so much to Eileen for taking a Microsoft Word document and making it really, really pretty. So I really appreciate that. Let's give Eileen a hand. She does. So I'm really happy to be here. I think if we had done it March 24th, there might have been fewer people. So this is nice to see. I just celebrated Camilla's birthday on my own. Ate an entire cake by myself. Just kidding. Yeah, that would have been really horrible, but I didn't. So I'm really happy to be here, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about Camilla. I'm happy to have the exhibit here. I don't know if you all know the backstory of it, but having an exhibit about Camilla, when I first had the idea for some kind of exhibit, it was specifically for her artwork. So I own some pieces of her art. And I thought, gosh, here's this side of Camilla maybe people don't really know about, that she was a really talented artist. And, I'd worked closely with people at Gustavus over the years because I got a lot of my research in the archives there. And so I'd known Don Myers for a million years, it seems. And so Don and I were talking about having a small exhibit at the Hillstrom for this work, and we had kind of planned for last September. Well, we all know what happened. With that, unfortunately, very sad news to not have the Hillstrom doing things anymore. But then I thought, well, I gotta find a way to do an exhibit somehow. And I think Eileen contacted me very shortly after I told Don that I would be looking to do it somewhere else. And so Nicollet County Historical Society just right away offered to have it. And obviously with the space that they have here and the interest and the audience for the Historical Society, it blossomed into so much more than just a couple of pieces of art. It really is like the full-scale story of Camilla's life. So I say that if you don't want to read the book or don't have time to read the book, you can just spin through the exhibit, and that will give you a good idea, a good overview of her life. So what I'll do tonight is I'll just talk a little bit specifically about her time in St. Peter. I don't know, how many people might know of exactly what that looked like, how the halls ended up in St. Peter, how long they were here. So that is what I'll specifically address to this audience. I'll talk a little bit about the writing of the book and even why I decided to write about Camilla. And then after that, I'd love to open it for some questions. So as I'm talking, if you think of some questions, I would be happy to field some. So Camilla's life in St. Peter was pretty brief. She really did only live here until she was about 11 or 12 years old, and then the family moved away. So her parents, George and Lorena, came to St. Peter in 1938, so he could take a job at Gustavus as a religion professor. They met at Bethany College in Lindsborg, Kansas. So Lorena was originally from Kansas, And then, so she was going to Bethany College as a student, and George had just been ordained as a pastor. He had just gone through seminary. He had gotten a parish, I believe it was in Gary, Indiana, as his first parish, and he wasn't there very long before Bethany College, which was part of the Swedish Lutheran, unit of colleges across the country. They needed a professor of religion, and they knew of him. They had heard good things about him. He was also a young single man, and so they thought that would be just a little easier to get somebody to come to Kansas, like middle of nowhere Kansas, if you didn't have to bring a whole family with you. So he was an attractive candidate on many fronts. So he gets to Bethany, Kansas, or Bethany College, and meets Lorena right away. When he gets there, he sees her from afar at a little picnic that they had at the beginning of the school year, and he thought, of course, she was just beautiful, and he wanted to get to know her a little bit more, but you couldn't, as a professor, you could not have relationships with students, and so it was kind of a whole year of that, like maybe old-fashioned courtship, where they would just talk and kind of get to know each other, maybe say hi in the dining hall or that kind of thing. And then when it later developed that, no, like things are blossoming here, they had to go to the neighboring town to have dates because they didn't want people talking about them, about a professor and a student being out. And she was not his student, but she was a student. So they went to the neighboring town to get coffee. They would go out into the countryside because she was a painter, so she would paint and he would read a book or write. So it was just very, very lovely kind of courtship. And it was her senior year of college when they, right after graduation, they got married. So at that point, they came to Gustavus again in the fall of 1938. And George Hall has an unpublished memoir that he wrote after Lorena died, and so there's a copy of that in the Gustavus archives. And in that memoir, he says that when he took the Gustavus job, he really envisioned this as a place that he would live out his life, like the lifetime job that he would have. And I think you can really see that was the intent, especially a couple of years later when their first son died, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But when the first son died, George bought the plots at Resurrection Cemetery. So I think there was this idea that, well, we'll always be here, and here's where we'll be buried, and St. Peter will always be a part of our life. So yes, tragedy did strike the family early. George and Lorena moved here. They quickly started a family. Terry was born in 1941, and Peter was born in 1942. So they had two sons right away. Camilla was born in 1945, and then they had a second daughter, Nan, in 1947. So in 6 years, they had the 4 children. George is teaching, and Lorena is teaching art at Gustavus. So she's part-time. She has all these little babies, but she's doing this part-time art teaching because, again, she's a very talented artist. In 1948, they take a trip out west, and Terry gets ill. So he's hospitalized. Then he appears to recover. He has a high fever, just not doing very well. Appears to recover, released from the hospital. They start heading back home to Minnesota, and in Rapid City, South Dakota, he gets sick again, goes to the hospital again, and dies there in Rapid City. And so he's 7 years old. It's the late 1940s, so I'm sure doctors don't exactly know what happened, and the family doesn't really know what happened, but all George wrote in his memoir was that it was a virus, like some kind of virus attacked the kid, or an infection. Maybe it was like a staph infection. No one really knows, but he did die. 3 years later, their second son, Peter, dies. And it's very tragic. Again, not really sure, but they think that was a kidney condition, and there seems to be some suspicion that there is actually some kind of genetic kidney condition that had afflicted the family. So little Peter dies, and now they're left with Camilla and Nan. Nan also has health problems. She was born with maybe what would be a joint disorder or a bone disorder. She has casts when she's just a very small child. She has like full leg casts and that kind of thing. So she needs a lot of attention. Camilla is fairly healthy as a young child. So it's the early 50s, and I think the deaths of those two children really made George and Lorena rethink being here in St. Peter. You know, obviously now their life is very sad, a lot of sad memories here. George gets an opportunity to do mission work in Africa. So they actually go to what is now Tanzania in 1954, so he can do mission work. So he goes with Lorena and the two girls. They're there for about 18 months, so they're spending a pretty significant amount of time there. Nan continues to have health issues, so that is one reason that they came back. So they're back in St. Peter in 1956. The girls re-enter the school system, but again, according to George's memoir, it looks like it's a little rocky re-entry into St. Peter life after being in Africa. So I think the girls really struggled when they were in Africa. Obviously, they weren't in a school system with children. Lorena was their teacher. So they were a very, very tight unit of three people, the mother and the two daughters. And so when they get back to St. Peter, the girls have to go back to school. I think it was really hard for them after spending all that time with Lorena. The children weren't super kind to the little girls. You know, at that point, Camilla must be about 11, Nan's about 9. The other kids had already formed their circles of friendships and their little cliques, and so it was hard for the girls to get reintegrated back into that. It sounds like there was some teasing, I mean, as little children kind of do, some teasing about their experiences in Africa. So I think the girls were having a really hard time, and again, pretty sad memories here in St. Peter for the Hall family. So in 1958, George and the rest of the family leave St. Peter, and they leave permanently. So they move to St. Paul. He takes a job at a St. Paul church, and they're in the Minneapolis area for about 5 years. 1963, when Camilla graduates from high school, from Washburn High School in Minneapolis, George and Lorena go to a suburb of Chicago, and that's where they lived out the rest of their lives. So once they went to the Chicago area, that's where they were, but here in St. Peter, they clearly retained very close ties. You know, they had a lot of friends here. George had a lot of colleagues at Gustavus. You can see from his letters and from what he wrote in his memoir that he still had, you know, a lot of very good friends here, and I think he really did cherish his time here. Bob S. Bjornson would be one of those good friends that he had really his whole life, Chet Johnson. So it's not like he packed up to forget St. Peter forever. I think he really did think of this place as a very special place, and you know, raising those early years of a family here. So that's the St. Peter connection to the Hall family. Again, not very long, but pretty significant in terms of the family. So yeah, I thought that I would talk a little bit too about the writing of the book and how I came across it. I came across it in 1999. That's when I first heard of Camilla Hall. That summer, I mean, it was June 17th, 1999. My husband teases me about my dates, but this really did stand out. June 17th, 1999, I was reading the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and the day before, on June 16th, you may remember, if you've been in Minnesota a while, that's when Sarah Jane Olson was arrested in St. Paul, Minnesota, for her involvement in the SLA. When she was in the SLA, her name was Kathleen Solaya, that was her birth name. And when Patty Hearst was arrested, when they caught everybody in 1975, there were 4, 5, 6 SLA members who weren't in the, you know, who weren't with Patty that day. So when they found out that some of the people were being arrested, they hightailed it. They're like, we gotta get out of here. We're going underground. So many of those SLA members went underground into hiding. Sarah Jane Olson ends up in Minnesota in the late 70s. She meets a guy here in Minneapolis. They get married, and she settles into quite a nice, comfortable life there in St. Paul. Her husband is an obstetrician. They have 3 daughters. She's pretty active in the community, being in plays, a volunteer, etc. So she's arrested in 1999 after appearing on America's Most Wanted. They wanted to try to find these fugitives from justice, and so somebody recognized her as a neighbor and turned her in. So obviously this was a big story. It was a big national story, so it was very big here in Minnesota too. So when I was reading the newspaper that next day about her arrest, there were many smaller stories that ran along with that big story. And one of the stories was just like an overview of the SLA, and there was a little picture of Camilla with a little caption underneath it. And it said how she had been born in St. Peter. And I just thought, what? Like, I had never heard of her. I've always lived in southern Minnesota. I'm from Waseca. At the time I was working at the Mankato Free Press. Like, I felt pretty tapped into this area. I felt pretty knowledgeable of towns and big events and that kind of thing, but had never heard of her. And just right away, I just thought, I need to know more. I think the caption had also talked about how her dad had been a professor at Gustavus and had been a pastor. So I just thought, how do you go from a small town, Minnesota girl, your dad's a pastor?
Oh no.
I've been talking too much. Probably average man. I can also yell really loud at any time. Get the red. I stopped on the suspenseful part, didn't I? You're going too close to my hands, right? Any jokes? Anyone? Yeah, no. Okay. True. Yeah, I used to teach 200 students, so I can project until the microphone arrives. Yes.
Question, maybe I just totally went over my head here. What happened to her sister who was
Oh,
sick?
Nan.
Yeah.
Yes, I can back up. I can back up and talk about that. I guess it's battery. Nan died in 1962 when they were living in Minneapolis. So Nan was a freshman at Washburn when Camilla was a senior, and Nan got, it was like Christmas time of 1962, and she started to get ill, kind of like, oh, I'm coughing, a lung infection, kind of your typical respiratory. So they took her to the hospital, but again, like she just rapidly went downhill, and within a week she also had died. But remember, she also had health problems throughout her years too, so that could have contributed to that. So yes, by the time Camilla is a senior in high school, her siblings are gone. So she's all by herself, the only child left. So yeah, that might have some factor, who knows, into some of her decisions. So I'm reading that article, want to know more about Camilla, because it just seemed like such a mystery how somebody does go from small town Minnesota to getting wrapped up in one of the most notorious organizations there were.
Thank you. Appreciate it. We need people like that. And so the SLA was one of the more violent, radical organizations that had existed in the 70s. So I just thought, wow, how does somebody get to that point where they say violence is an option? Like, I'm willing to buy a gun, I'm willing to do whatever it takes in the name of revolution. So I started at Gustavus with Mike Hauser was the archivist at that time. I went through the George Hall documents, and he left a lot of documents to Gustavus, so it really was a wonderful treasure trove. And I was working at the Mankato Free Press at the time, so I'd gone to my editor and said, how about a story on Camilla Hall? It can be the local angle to this larger Minnesota national story that's going on. So she said, sure. So that's where my research started, was in 1999. I was also in a master's program at MSU at the time in history, and I thought, well, I do need a thesis. topic. So this would give me an excuse to do more research on Camilla. So I did that, graduated in 2004, so I would say for kind of those 5 years, I am focusing on doing this research. And my first iteration of my master's thesis was more narrative. Like, Camilla's story is just so fascinating and human that I didn't want to write kind of like a dry report about it. And so I had 2 history professors on my committee and a journalism professor of mine. And the journalism professor was very much into, the new journalism of the 60s and telling stories with a, really personal angle, which I loved. And so I said, yeah, let's do that. Well, then I gave it to my history professor, and he was like, you can't do that. so I didn't think I could, but I wanted to try, okay? And it's funny because I've seen it, it's Chuck Peel, if anybody knows Chuck Peel, but I've seen him since, and but right before my book came out, I had little postcards made up. I was at the Deep Valley Book Festival, and I saw Chuck's wife, Kathy, and so I said, okay, listen, Chuck, my thesis is going to be a book now. And he sent me the nicest email. He was like, I'm so sorry that I said that to you. Clearly you knew what you were doing, but it was just really funny. I said, I don't blame you at all. You were a history professor. It's not like I didn't have research, but it was just more on the creative side of history, I guess. So did it for my history thesis, and then I did take a break from it for a while because while I was working on my history degree, I also was writing a memoir. I thought, well, hey, I have an idea for a memoir. Why don't I do that? So I do have a memoir, and that came out in 2013. So once I was done with my schoolwork, I thought, I can get back to my memoir, which I had put on hold while I was working on my thesis. So I worked on my memoir for about the next 7 years, and that came out in 2013. So then when that came out, I thought, now I can go back to Camilla. I can work on this other book. And that was a year I also entered a PhD program in creative writing. So finally, I could write the book in that narrative, creative way that I always wanted to, 15 years before. So the book, or the manuscript, did become part of my creative dissertation. So even though 1999 to when the book was published in 2022 is 23 years, if anybody's doing the math, I like to say it's not like day in and day out I'm working on this book for 23 years. There were these huge swaths of time when I wasn't even touching it, or certainly not writing it. Came out in 2022, and there it is, in the format that I wanted to do it in the first place, back when I was a master's student. But if you pick up the book, if you look at it, because I do have a master's degree in history, research is really important to me. So I would like to think people can tell that it is well researched. I put in my time, tracked down people, found documents. There's a notes section in the back of the book, so if you want to check my sources, that's all there. It is definitely a more creative approach. And I do take a long time to write. At least these books I do. I don't know why. Because I worked at the Free Press as a journalist, I can write fast. I really can. I can turn out something in a day. But nonfiction, I only write nonfiction, I don't write anything else. And it's really hard for me. It takes a lot of time because I feel like there's all this thinking time that has to go into it, and I don't want to talk bad about fiction writers because I've never written it. I'm sure you have to think when you write fiction too. But I'm thinking especially with my memoir, which was about growing up in Waseca. My dad was a grave digger, so I knew that it was formative, a formative way to grow up around so much death. I didn't know how it was formative, so I could sit down and I could write stories. I could write my memories. I remember all these things, but when it came down to figuring out what did it mean, or how did it shape me? I had to think a long time. And even once I figured it out, it's not like I could just write and here's how it shaped me. Like, you want to be a little bit more creative than that. So it took me just a really long time to just do that thought process of like, what did my life mean? And for Camilla, like writing about somebody else it feels more natural to me and a little bit easier given my research background, but still, I still had to try to attach some meaning to her life. I couldn't just write like a report of dates, and so it still did take quite a bit of thinking to try to attach a little bit of meaning to what is this larger story. And I think the timing actually did work out really well, even though it was so long. But when I first started the book in 1999, like 1974 had just been 25 years in the past. And you know how that kind of goes, like, oh, that was that time, and now it's this time, and that's in the past. But everything cycles again. Like, you historians know that, right? Everything comes around again. And so when I was putting the finishing touches on this, it was 2020. Like, it was the summer of 2020. And then it was January 6, 2021. And I thought, wow, like, we really are seeing people again, like, so frustrated, like Camilla was, and not content to just say, I'm so frustrated, but actually thinking, how can I make this frustration known to the larger world? Do I need to take up arms, to make my frustration known? So I feel like at this time, we're kind of seeing that that activism again, and people willing to do like some radical things because of that. Yes?
So what actually was the SLA about? What was the purpose?
Yeah, that's a great question. On the surface, so she asked, what did the SLA stand for? Like, what were they fighting for? So on the surface, if you just looked at what was important to them, they wanted equality, they wanted equal rights, they wanted these things that many people in the 1960s were fighting for. They didn't want war, they wanted peace, that kind of thing. All sorts of equality, racial equality, gender equality, socioeconomic equality. They certainly weren't capitalists, so we can say that. And they really studied a lot of revolutionary groups around the world. So the 60s just globally was a real hotbed of revolutions in different countries in South America and Eastern Europe. But ultimately, they weren't content to just do the peaceful protest. They said stuff is seriously wrong in this country, we don't like it, and we're willing to be violent in order to make our point known. So that is really what set them apart from any other protest group of that time, just their willingness to, they really did see themselves as revolutionaries, but they were a group of 8. They were just really very, very tiny, but they had big ideas. Yeah. But yeah, I am going to break there, because those are the 2 main things I wanted to cover, but I would love to open it up to any other questions or comments that people may have. Yes, sir.
Where did they get the name Symbionese?
Yeah.
I thought when this was happening in the 70s, we were raising a family, I thought it was a country.
Oh, exactly. It sounds like a country, doesn't it?
Sort of.
Yeah, it sounds like, like Lebanese. That's a great question. What does the Symbionese stand for? It's a biological term, so symbiosis is a biological term. That's about as much as I know. But it's this idea that 2 different organisms come together to produce something better. Yeah, so it's basically like cooperation. Like, these organisms are coming together to cooperate, even though on the surface, maybe it looks like they wouldn't be able to do that. Yeah. So then Symbionese. But you weren't alone. Like, nobody knew what this SLA, what the heck that was. Yes?
What people did you all interview?
Yeah, so what people did I interview? Unfortunately, I never got a chance to talk to George Hall. George died in 2000, and I came across the story in 1999. But when I went to the Gustavus Archives and talked to Mike Hauser, and I told him what I wanted to do. I wanted to write a newspaper article. He said, I really feel more comfortable if I could get in touch with George just to make sure it's okay if we use the documents in this way. So Mike went through Bob Esbjornson, who wrote a letter to George and said, there's this reporter wants to use your documents to do a newspaper story, would that be okay? And George replied with the go-ahead, yep, that's fine. But I never had contact with him himself, and then he died the next day, or the next year. So it really was tricky because of her family dying, Her parents had been dead, obviously her siblings are dead at that point. The Halls are also a family because of their moving around and his job as a pastor. Camilla didn't grow up with aunts and uncles and cousins like many of us might be familiar with. So even when I found family members, they knew George or they knew Lorena, but they never knew Camilla. But I was able to find some friends, some people she knew, like at different periods of her life, when she was in Minneapolis for college, when she was out in Los Angeles. And the other unfortunate thing is like people who would have known her at the end of her life, when she joins the SLA, they died with her. So she died on May 17th, 1974 in a shootout. So there's really only 3 people alive who knew Camilla during that time, and none of them are talking. One is Patty Hearst, and the other 2 are Bill and Emily Harris, and they're kind of famously jerks. So they don't want to talk to anyone either. And Sarah Jane Olsen, I did interview her, but she didn't know Camilla, but at least talking to her, I could get a sense of what it was like to be active during that time, to be in a group like that. So I had to do kind of a lot of coming at it at different angles for lack of people who really knew Camilla herself. So it did make it tricky, but also thankfully Camilla left a lot of letters behind. She was a really prolific letter writer to her parents. So I feel like through her letters, her art, there's a PhD dissertation out there where the guy who wrote that was able to interview her parents, and he was nice enough to give me his cassette tapes and his transcripts, so it's like I was able to get the words from people who were close to Camilla, but just obviously not from her herself or not from her parents herself. So yeah, it's kind of like, again, that back channel ways to try to get information about her. Yes?
So you're saying there are some ways that her art and her writing kind of show how she lived her life?
Yeah, and we have all of that over there. So you can look at it too, but in fact, I was just talking to my friend Kirsten right before this, and we were looking at her poems again. And I mean, just as a writer to read these poems, but Kirsten knows more about poetry than I do. But you were saying how, these are not poems of somebody who wants to kill the world. These are poems that are they're about relationships, they're about love, they're about what a 25-year-old woman would be writing about, So just even maybe not necessarily, I feel like it kind of showed what she wasn't thinking. She wasn't thinking revolution in the early 70s. She was thinking how many young people think. So in that way, to kind of try to assess what are these saying about her? Yeah. Yes.
I knew Camilla. We were friends. She graduated from Washburn in 1963. I graduated in 1964.
And we were in a church group together at Mount Olivet. Camilla was, and her class was well over 500. There were 596 in my graduating class. We had the largest graduating class, so her class would have been a little bit smaller. Nan died when Camilla was a senior. She died in December. I always thought that it was a kidney problem.
Yeah.
But anyway, Camilla was had the lead in the senior class play. She was voted class president. We were in this church group together with just had a good time, did a lot of things. She was funny, she was talented. We certainly never expected the outcome that came about. And I remember the shootout was broadcast live on television. And I was at home with a 3-week-old baby watching television, witnessing this, and I could not believe that it was Camilla. I mean, it just did not fit her at all. But it was also, in the 60s was a time of protest with the war. And just, the drug scene came a little bit later than that. And there was just a lot of unrest in the world.
Yeah, and what you have said about Camilla has been remarkably consistent among anyone that I've interviewed about her, and certainly since the book has come out, a lot more people have come forward and have said, I knew Camilla, or went to high school with her, college with her, and they all say the same thing. So I feel really confident in my assessment of her that she, in her writings, in the way people have talked about her, she does come across as just friendly and funny and a person you would want to be with, just really entertaining. Like nobody has ever said a bad word about her with everyone that I've talked to. So yeah, that is really remarkably consistent. Is there a question here? Okay.
It sort of answered my question, but who was the we in your title, not the Camilla?
Oh, yes. Yeah, that comes directly from a friend that guy who wrote the dissertation had interviewed, where she just said, in the transcript, she just said, well, this wasn't the Camilla we knew, but yes, like, my editor helped me come up with that title, and just everything in the book really reflected that. Yeah. That it's kind of it becomes a collective we, even though it's a direct quote, but it is really like her parents, her other friends, like everyone would have said something like that. And
when I was researching her mother for the Nicollet County Artist Project, I got a hold of some of her family, and Lorena was essentially disowned by the family when Camilla joined the FLA. They didn't want anything to do with her, and I talked with a cousin of hers, and I think by the time I got done talking to him, he maybe was coming around to think maybe she wasn't as horrible as the family was thinking.
Yeah.
And his mother had died
Yeah.
previously, and it was really his mother. But so the Halls lost that family connection.
they sure did, and I'm glad that you said that, because I remembered that I wanted to say something about that too, that Lorena had 3 sisters, and there's also an interview that another woman had done who wanted to write a book about Camilla. She had interviewed George and Lorena probably in the early 80s, and Lorena talked a little bit about her family, and there was one sister, they all ended up in different parts of the United States, but there was one sister who died of cancer and didn't even, Lorena had no idea until she got a phone call and said, oh, your sister died. Oh, she had cancer, okay. So something, the family connections there got severed. And also going back to who I interviewed, I wanted to get a hold of a living family member, even if they didn't know Camilla, just almost from an ethical standpoint, that Camilla's story is not my story to tell. And so I felt a little bit weird about that. But I thought, well, if I could at least get a hold of a family member and let them know what I'm doing, I maybe would feel a little bit better ethically. So I did end up, thanks to Don, I ended up in contact with Nan, who is, her mom was Camilla's first cousin on the Hall side. But Nan says the same thing, that her mother, as Camilla's cousin, would not talk about Camilla, would say she was a black sheep, did not want any association with Camilla. And even when I contacted Nan, which was probably 2014, her mom said, don't talk to her. don't talk to this writer. You should not be talking about Camilla. So even all those years later, for her mom in that generation, it was still very much like a very, very sore subject. Like they did not want to be associated with somebody who was so radical. And Nan is kind of a mover and a shaker type of person in her community. She lives in Sioux Falls, and her mom was really concerned about her. She's like, man, if you want to keep like being successful and doing these things, her husband was a banker in town. She was like, you cannot tell people that you are related to this person. And this was 2014. But thank God Nan knew that wasn't the situation. And Nan has been so wonderful and such a help. She knew George very well. She spent a lot of time with George as her great uncle. And Nan very much wanted this story to be told, to kind of tell people, like, how can we, if people feel really strongly about something, how can we like work with them before they go down a path like this? Like should we be listening to them? And what lessons does Camilla have for us? So Nan felt very strongly that she wanted Camilla's story out there despite her family's warnings. And Nan's doing just great. So the book did not affect her at all. I can vouch for that. Back here.
Was there an event that changed Camilla?
Oh, an event? Yeah, so she's asking, was there one event or something that changed Camilla? And that whole trying to address that is maybe like the last third of my book. And I don't think, it's not just any one thing. I think it's just a variety of factors. Certainly, the early deaths of her siblings are going to have a pretty major impact. The way she communicated with her parents, they had a good relationship, and it appeared to be very loving, but it also appeared to be a little distant. So I think there were some family issues going on there. Camilla lived apart from her parents once she was a senior in high school. She never lived near them or with them again. So there's some family distance, so there could be some family issues going on there. There's also a theory that some of Camilla's friends had posited at the time that since Peter and Nan seemed to have had this kidney condition, that Camilla was worried about her own health and in fact suspected that she was soon to also die from this family genetic condition. And so a couple of friends said, maybe she thought she was dying, or maybe she actually knew she was going to die and thought, why not go out, like, what do I have to lose? Why not go out this way? So we'll never know. We will just never know. All we have to do is kind of look at all the pieces of her life and see what maybe factored into that. But that's one reason, we don't know. So I would love it if people read the book and then they can make their own decisions. Like there can be a lot of different theories that people might have about why Camilla did this once they read about the entirety of her life.
So maybe was she in love with one of them or something?
Yeah, so that's something I didn't address either. When she moved to Berkeley in 1971, she moved to an apartment building, and her neighbor was a young woman named Patricia Soltysik. So they quickly became an item and became involved with each other. They had a very on and off again relationship. So there were periods of time, especially by 1973 when the SLA was forming, that it appears Camilla and Patricia, later known as Ms. Moon, were not in contact anymore. But clearly, something changed by the end of that year. So there's some people, too, who would say that Camilla was still in love with Ms. Moon, that when Ms. Moon formed the SLA and helped to develop it, that she wanted to join to be back with her. Ms. Moon did. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she was one of the leading architects in early 1973. Yeah, and she was much more like in terms of being outwardly radical. People around Ms. Moon could see that, like it was pretty obvious to them that she was up to something. Whereas everyone who knew Camilla throughout 1973 would not have said that about her. Mm-hmm.
At what point did Camilla shed her interest in art and did connecting with the SLA convince her that was the way to do it?
At what point do you think the SLA convinced her?
Well,
that
At what point did she stop being interested in doing art? And
oh yeah.
He hasn't like kind of cement that deal.
Yeah. So when did Camilla stop doing her art? You know, I have not seen anything of Camilla's art post dated past 71. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I know that's when she was really active in 1970, 71, living in California as an artist and selling her stuff at art fairs. When she moved to Berkeley, she actually got into parks and landscaping. She was very, very good with plants, so she was very nurturing. So she did some like freelance landscaping, and then in 1973 she was working for the Parks District in Oakland. So she's still working, like kind of working what you would say like normal jobs, but really does not seem to be doing her art at that time. But something in late 73, whether Ms. Moon contacts her and says, hey, maybe you'd like to join this group, or whether Camilla contacts Ms. Moon, like that piece of it is unknown. Like exactly at what point did Camilla make that decision to get involved with this group? Anything, I don't know, how are we doing on time, Justin?
So are the book on sale right now?
Oh, yeah, oh, what a great question. Yes, my book is for sale. I do have books for sale. I think I have 18 of them, which is my entire stock. Thank you. I have limit, so they're $17. I have limited ones, if you have 20s, unless some of my friends here have any ones. I almost contacted you guys, like bring some ones, because I didn't get a chance to. Otherwise, I have Venmo, or I have the Square Reader, if you have a credit card, you can do that too. Yeah. Should I end up?
And some.
Oh, I will sign them too, yes. Should I end on that note? On the promo? Books for sale? I have some memoirs too.
Thank you, Rachel. This is so exciting. I just want to take a quick opportunity. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. We appreciate it very much. Thank you to everyone who made the event possible tonight. And thank you, of course, to Rachel for the lovely program and for having books, because ours are back ordered. We tried. We tried so hard.
Maybe that's a good sign.
There you go. There you go. Absolutely. Good for you. Fantastic. There's a little bit of coffee left, a few bars, some cookies. Thank you again, everyone, for coming.